Story 1. The tall figure over Aunt Margaret's bed. Haven was a speck of a town, a cluster of weathered houses and crooked barns nestled against the coast where the Atlantic growled and the fog rolled in like a living thing. Jake Perry spent his summers there, a 16-year-old with a wiry frame and a mop of dark hair he couldn't tame, escaping the chaos of his parents' divorce in Portland. His Aunt Margaret, a stout woman in her 60s with silver hair and a smoker's cough, lived in a farmhouse on the edge of town, a sagging two-story with a wraparound porch that creaked under every step. The house smelled of mildew and old wood, its windows staring blank over fields that stretched to the sea. And Jake had always found it a refuge, until this summer, when the quiet started to feel wrong. Margaret welcomed him with her usual gruff affection, setting him up in the attic room, small, with slanted ceilings and a single window that rattled in the wind. The bed was a lumpy mattress on an iron frame, the floorboards warped, and a dusty mirror hung crooked on the wall. Jake liked it up there, away from the world, where he could read Stephen King novels, pilfered from the town library, and listen to the sea's distant roar. Margaret worked part-time at the post office, leaving him alone most days, and he filled the time exploring the fields, biking to the pier, or helping with chores, feeding the chickens, mucking the barn. It was routine, comforting, until the shadows began to shift. It started in mid-July, the air thick with humidity, the kind of night where the fog clung to the house like a shroud. Jake got back from the pier at 11 p.m., the taste of salt water on his lips, and climbed to the attic, the stairs groaning under his sneakers. Margaret was asleep, her snores rumbling through the floorboards, and the house was still, the only sound the tick of the old clock downstairs. He read Pet Sematary by flashlight, the story's chill sinking into him until his eyes grew heavy. He turned off the light, the room plunging into darkness, and drifted off, the sea's murmur a faint lullaby. Around 2 a.m., he woke, not with a start, but with a sense, a weight on his chest that wasn't sleep paralysis. The room was black, the window a gray square, and he lay still, listening. A creak came from downstairs, soft but deliberate, like someone stepping careful on the old boards. "Aunt Margaret," he whispered, but her snores continued, steady and deep. He sat up, heart thudding, and grabbed the flashlight, the beam cutting a shaky arc across the room. Empty, just the mirror reflecting his pale face. The creak came again, closer now, from the hall outside his door, and Jake's skin prickled, every nerve on edge. He eased the door open, the hinges whining, and stepped into the hall, the air colder, thick with a smell like damp earth and something sour. The flashlight swept the narrow space, pictures of Margaret's youth on the walls, a rug worn thin, but nothing moved. The creak stopped, replaced by a shuffle, low and slow, coming from Margaret's room at the end. Jake's mouth went dry, his hands sweaty on the flashlight, and he crept forward, the house groaning around him. Her door was ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond, and he pushed it open, light trembling. Margaret slept, her chest rising and falling, a cigarette pack on the nightstand, but the air felt wrong, heavy, watching. Jake swept the beam across the room, dresser, chair, bed, and froze. A figure stood over her, tall and gaunt, its back to him, a shadow against the wall. It was human-shaped, but wrong, too thin, its head cocked like it was listening, its hands hovering above her. Jake's breath caught, a scream lodging in his throat, and the figure turned, slow, deliberate, its face a blur, eyes deep hollows, mouth a slash of nothing. He stumbled back, the flashlight clattering, and screamed, a raw sound that shattered the silence. Margaret jolted awake, lamp snapping on, her cough harsh. "Jake, what the hell?" she rasped, sitting up, but the figure was gone, the room empty except for the lingering chill. Jake panted, pointing at the bed. There was someone. Margaret squinted, rubbing her eyes, and checked the room. Windows locked, door shut, nothing out of place. "Nightmare, kid," she said, voice gruff, but her hands shook as she lit a cigarette. Jake nodded, shaken, and went back to the attic, lights on, the knife from the kitchen under his pillow. The creak didn't return, but the weight lingered, a presence he couldn't shake. The next day, he asked Margaret about the house. Had anyone died here? Been sick? She waved it off. Just an old farm, Jake. No ghosts. But her eyes flicked to the hall, and he knew she wasn't telling all. He biked to the library, dug through local records, and found a note. 1947. A farmhand, Thomas Reed, died in the attic after a fall, found rocking in pain, muttering about the dark. The photo was faded, a tall man in overalls, face blurred, and Jake's blood ran cold. That night, he stayed awake, listening, the flashlight ready. Haven's quiet hid something, and the figure over Margaret's bed was just the beginning. Jake Perry couldn't shake the image of that figure over Aunt Margaret's bed, its gaunt shape etched into his mind like a scar. The farmhouse on Haven's edge grew heavier each night, its creaks a language he couldn't decipher, its shadows deeper than they should have been. Margaret brushed off his unease with a smoker's cough and a wave, insisting it was just nerves, but her glances at the hall betrayed her. Jake kept the attic light on, the kitchen knife under his pillow, and Juniper, the stray cat Margaret fed, started hissing at the stairs, his yellow eyes fixed on nothing Jake could see. The sea's distant roar felt miles away, the house a world unto itself, holding something close. He dug deeper after finding the library note about Thomas Reed. Back in the attic, flashlight in hand, he rifled through Margaret's old trunks, the air thick with dust and mildew. A faded ledger turned up, farm records from 1947, Thomas's name scratched in. Last entry a week before his fall, muttering about the dark after a storm. A photo slipped out. Thomas, tall and lean, overalls stained, face blurred but eyes hollow, rocking in the barn's shadow. Jake's stomach nodded. That tilt of the head, that shape, it matched the figure. He showed Margaret, her cigarette trembling. "Just a hand who fell," she said, but her voice cracked and she turned away, the truth hanging unspoken. That night, the house felt alive. Jake stayed awake. Pet Cemetery open but unread. The knife cold against his leg. Around 2:15 a.m., a creak rolled through the floorboards, slow and deliberate, from the hall. Juniper bolted, hissing, and Jake grabbed the flashlight, stepping out. The air was icy, smelling of damp earth and something sour, like rot. The creaks moved, downstairs, then back up, stopping outside Margaret's door. He crept forward, light sweeping the dark, and pushed her door open. She slept, snoring soft. But the figure was there, taller now, its gown tattered, rocking over her, hands hovering, a low whisper escaping. The dark, the dark. Jake's scream caught in his throat, the flashlight dropping, beam spinning wild. Margaret woke, lamp on. "Jake, damn it!" But the figure vanished, the whisper fading into the walls. She checked the room, windows locked, nothing moved, but the chill lingered, her hands shaking as she lit a cigarette. "You're seeing things," she growled, but her eyes darted, and Jake knew she felt it too. He went back to the attic, lights blazing, the knife clutched tight, the whisper echoing in his skull. The next night, he set a trap, salt across the threshold, a trick from an online forum, and a recorder by the door. At 2:30 a.m., the creaks returned, heavier, the salt scattering as if brushed aside. The whisper grew. The dark took me, and the attic door creaked open. The figure standing there, Thomas Reed, his face a blur, eyes black voids, rocking slow. Jake froze, knife up, the recorder humming. "What do you want?" he shouted, voice breaking. The figure tilted its head, stepping closer, its whisper a growl. "Stay with me." Jake swung the knife, the blade passing through, and the figure lunged, cold hands grazing his arm. A shock of ice that dropped him to his knees. He scrambled up, recorder still running, and fled downstairs. Margaret awake, shotgun in hand. "What's happening?" she demanded, loading shells, her cough sharp. They searched, the attic empty, the salt gone, but the recorder caught it. A whisper, a growl, then a child's sob, faint and lost. Margaret paled, lowering the gun. Thomas had a kid, she admitted, voice low. Died in the storm, same night. Never talked about it. Jake's blood ran cold. 2 souls, not one. They called Father Malone the next day, a wiry priest with a smoker's rasp, who blessed the house, incense curling thick. The creaks stopped, the figure gone, but the sob lingered, a soft echo from the attic. Margaret burned sage. Jake kept the recorder, replaying that sob, a reminder of a child lost. They stayed, the house lighter, but never warm, and Jake started sleeping with the lights on, knife close. Months later, in Portland, he'd hear it, a creak, a whisper, faint, like a memory Haven wouldn't release. Margaret aged fast, her cough worsening, and Jake knew Thomas and his child were still there, rocking in the dark, waiting for someone to join them. Story 2. The Bus Driver Who Wasn't. Pine Hill Valley was a town where the shadows seemed to linger too long, a place of quiet streets and old secrets, where the Penobscot River whispered through the fog and the woods held stories no one dared tell. Tommy Harper, a skinny 10-year-old with freckles and a mop of red hair he hid under a worn Red Sox cap, knew every inch of his neighborhood on Pine Street, a row of clapboard houses with sagging porches where the streetlights flickered and the air always smelled of damp leaves. He was in 4th grade at Derry Elementary, a brick building a mile away, and every morning he was the last kid on the school bus route, waiting alone at the corner where Pine met Elm, the stop sign bent from a storm years back. Tommy didn't mind being the last pickup. He liked the quiet, the way the morning fog curled around the trees. The only sounds the distant bark of a dog or the creak of his neighbor's gate. His mom, Diane, worked early shifts at the diner on Main Street, and his dad, Frank, was a mechanic at the garage, always smelling of oil and grease. They'd leave before sunrise, Diane kissing his forehead, Frank ruffling his hair, and Tommy would wait, backpack slung over one shoulder, kicking pebbles into the gutter. The bus, driven by Mr. Carter, a gruff man with a gray beard and a laugh like a bark, always rolled up at 7:15 a.m. The other kids' faces pressed to the windows, waving as Tommy climbed aboard. That Tuesday started like any other, the air sharp with October's bite, the fog thicker than usual, turning the street into a gray tunnel. Tommy stood at the corner, breath fogging, his sneakers scuffing the cracked pavement. He'd overslept, skipping breakfast, his stomach rumbling as he waited, the Red Sox cap pulled low over his eyes. The street was empty, no cars, No dogs, just the fog and the faint hum of the town waking up. At 7:10 a.m., he heard it, the low rumble of an engine, the creak of brakes, and a yellow bus emerged from the mist, its headlights cutting through the haze. It stopped, the door hissing open, but something was off. The bus was empty, no kids' faces at the windows, no chatter, just silence. The driver leaned forward, a man Tommy didn't recognize. Not Mr. Carter, but someone new, younger, with a shaved head and a smile that stretched too wide, showing teeth that gleamed in the dim light. "Hop on, kid," he said, voice smooth, almost too friendly, his eyes unblinking, locked on Tommy. The boy hesitated, a chill prickling his neck, his gut twisting with a feeling he couldn't name. "Where's Mr. Carter?" Tommy asked, voice small, his backpack heavy on his shoulder. The man's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed, just a flicker. "Sick today. I'm filling in. Come on, we'll get the others now. Just get on." Tommy took a step back, the fog cold against his skin, the bus's engine idling like a growl. "Where are the other kids?" he pressed, peering into the empty seats, the windows smudged with grime, the interior dark despite the headlights. The driver's smile tightened, his hands gripping the wheel, knuckles white. "We're running a new route today," he said, voice still smooth, but with an edge now, a push. "They're waiting up ahead. Get on, Tommy." The boy froze. How did he know his name? He hadn't said it, hadn't shown his backpack tag, and the man's eyes were too steady, too hungry, like a wolf watching a rabbit. I think I'll walk," Tommy stammered, stepping back again, the stop sign cold against his shoulder as he bumped it. The driver's smile dropped just for a second, his face darkening, and he leaned out the door, his voice sharper. "Get on the bus, kid. Now." Tommy shook his head, the chill turning to ice in his veins, and the man's hand twitched, reaching for something under the seat. A flash of metal, quick and gone. "No," Tommy said, louder, and turned, running down Pine Street, the fog swallowing him, the bus's engine revving behind him, a low growl that chased him through the mist. He didn't stop until he reached the end of the block, lungs burning, and hid behind Mrs. Peterson's hedge, the leaves scratching his arms. The bus rolled past, slow, the driver's head turning, searching, his smile back but colder, a predator's grin. It turned the corner, disappearing into the fog, and Tommy waited, trembling, until he heard another engine, Mr. Carter's bus, the real one, rattling up at 7:15 a.m., the kids' faces at the windows, waving. Tommy ran out, climbed aboard, Mr. Carter's gruff, "Morning, kid," a lifeline. He didn't tell Carter about the other bus. Not then, but the man's grin stayed with him, a shadow in his mind, and Derry's fog felt heavier that day, hiding something worse than the cold. Tommy Harper didn't tell Mr. Carter about the fake bus driver that morning. The word stuck in his throat like a stone as he climbed aboard the real school bus. The other kids chatter a distant hum. Derry Elementary was a blur that day. Math lessons, recess, the cafeteria's meatloaf, all of it overshadowed by the man's grin, that too wide smile with teeth that gleamed like a predator's, and the way he'd said Tommy's name, Tommy, like he'd known him forever. The fog on Pine Street had lifted by afternoon, but the chill stayed, a cold knot in Tommy's gut that tightened every time he thought of the empty bus, the driver's hand reaching for something under the seat, the flash of metal he couldn't unsee. He got home at 3:30 p.m. The house on Pine Street quiet. His mom, Diane, still at the diner. His dad, Frank, at the garage. Tommy dropped his backpack by the door, the Red Sox cap falling to the floor, and went to the kitchen, grabbing a soda from the fridge. The cans hiss loud in the stillness. He sat at the table, staring out the window at the street, the stop sign at the corner of Elm, a bent silhouette against the gray sky. The memory of the bus gnawed at him, and he knew he had to tell someone, his parents maybe, or Mrs. Peterson next door, who always had cookies and stories about Derry's past. But the words felt heavy, like saying them would make it real. Diane got home at 6 p.m., her diner uniform smelling of grease, her smile tired but warm. Frank followed an hour later, oil on his hands, his laugh filling the kitchen as he cracked a beer. Tommy waited until they were at the table, spaghetti steaming, before he spoke, his voice small. "Something happened this morning," he said, and they froze, forks halfway to their mouths. He told them the empty bus, the driver who wasn't Mr. Carter, the smile, the way he knew Tommy's name, the metal flash, the run through the fog. Diane's face paled, her hand gripping Frank's arm, and Frank's jaw tightened, his beer forgotten. "You're sure?" he asked, voice low, and Tommy nodded, the soda can cold in his hand. Diane grabbed the phone, dialing the school, her voice sharp as she demanded answers. Where was Mr. Carter, who drove the bus? What the hell was going on? The principal, Mrs. Larson, confirmed Carter had been there. No subs, no reports of another bus. Diane hung up, her hands shaking, and called the sheriff, Deputy Hargrove, a gruff man with a gray mustache who'd known Frank since high school. Hargrove came over, notepad in hand, and listened as Tommy recounted it again, his freckles stark against his pale face. "Sounds like a drifter," Hargrove said, but his eyes flicked to the window, where the fog was rolling back in, thicker now, turning the streetlights into ghosts. "We'll look into it. Stay safe, kid." The next morning, Tommy didn't wait at the corner. Diane drove him to school, her knuckles white on the wheel, Frank following in his truck to the garage. Mr. Carter was there, gruff as ever, and Tommy felt a flicker of relief. But the memory lingered, a shadow he couldn't shake. At school, he told his best friend, Billy, a chubby kid with glasses who loved comics. Billy's eyes widened. "Sounds like the Smiling Man," he whispered, pulling Tommy to the library at lunch. He showed him a book, Derry's Dark History, a faded collection of local lore. A page told of a man in the 70s, a transient who drove a stolen bus, luring kids with a smile, never seen again after they boarded. "They found one," Billy said, "torn up in the woods." Tommy's stomach dropped. The grin, the bus, it fit. That night, the fog was worse, a thick blanket that swallowed the street, the stop sign invisible from the house. Diane kept Tommy inside, the doors locked, Frank's shotgun by the couch. At 2:17 a.m., Tommy woke, not to a sound, but a feeling, a weight in the air. He crept to the window, the fog pressing against the glass, and saw it, a yellow bus, parked at the corner, headlights off, its door open, the driver's silhouette inside, head turned toward the house. The man smiled, that same grin, and waved, slow and deliberate, before the bus rolled away, vanishing into the mist. Tommy screamed, Diane and Frank rushing in, Frank grabbing the shotgun. But the street was empty, the fog undisturbed. Hargrove came again, found no tracks, no sign, but his face was grim. "Keep him close," he told Diane, and she nodded, tears in her eyes. They moved a month later to a small place near the diner, but Tommy never forgot. The grin, the wave, the bus that shouldn't have been. He stopped waiting at corners, started jumping at fog, and sometimes, in the gray mornings, he'd hear it, a bus's engine, faint, rolling through Derry streets, looking for the last kid to pick up, a smile waiting in the mist. Story 3, The Raspy Giggle. Willowbrook Springs wasn't a city of bright lights or bustling crowds. It was a gritty sprawl of brick buildings and narrow streets where the Penobscot River cast a shadow that never quite lifted. The Rusty Anchor, a dive bar on the edge of downtown, was a haven for the town's night owls, its neon sign flickering red against the fog, its jukebox groaning with old Springsteen tracks. Caleb Monroe, a lean 30-year-old with a scruffy beard and hands calloused from years at the lumber mill, loved the place. He'd grown up in Bangor, a town of quiet despair and whispered tales, and the Anchor's smoky air and cheap beer were his escape from a crumbling apartment and a job that paid too little. His best friend, Nate, a mechanic with a laugh like a chainsaw, often dragged him out, And that Friday night was no different. It started with a call from Nate, his voice crackling over the phone at 8 p.m. "Come on, man. Opening act's killer tonight. Some local band, heavy metal vibes. Meet me at the Anchor." Caleb sighed, the mill's exhaustion in his bones, but the promise of a beer and noise pulled him in. He threw on a flannel, grabbed his worn leather jacket, and headed out, the streets slick with October rain, the fog rolling thick off the river. The Anchor was alive when he arrived, crowded with mill workers, bikers, and a few tourists brave enough to wander in, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the tang of spilled beer. Nate waved from a corner table, a pitcher of Budweiser sweating in front of him, and Caleb slid into the chair, the music a wall of sound that drowned out the day. They drank deep, the band's riffs shaking the walls, the crowd cheering as the lead singer growled into the mic. Caleb lost track of time. 2 beers, then 3, the buzz warm in his chest, the noise a cocoon. Around midnight, as the band took a break, he patted his pocket for his phone, a habit to check the time, and froze, empty. "Damn it," he muttered, patting his jacket, his jeans, the table. Nothing. Nate laughed. "Lost it already? Check the bar, the John." Caleb nodded, weaving through the crowd, the smoke stinging his eyes, the floor sticky under his boots. He searched the bar counter, the bathroom stalls, even the jukebox where he'd leaned earlier. Nothing but grime and spilled drinks. Back at the table, he slumped, the buzz fading to frustration. "Gone," he said, and Nate slid his phone across. "Call it. See if someone picks up." Caleb dialed his number, the ringtone a faint echo in his head. Sweet Home Alabama, a joke from college. And after 2 rings, someone answered. Not a voice, not words, just a giggle, low and raspy, a sound like sandpaper dragged over glass, cold and deliberate. It lingered, a breath, then the line went dead. Caleb stared at the phone, his hand trembling, the bar's noise fading to a distant hum. "Who was that?" Nate asked, leaning in. But Caleb shook his head, the giggle replaying, a shiver crawling up his spine. He tried again. Ring, ring, nothing. The call dropping into silence. "Probably a prank," Nate said, shrugging, but his eyes were wary, the mill-hardened mechanic sensing something off. Caleb forced a laugh. "Yeah, some drunk kid." But the unease stuck, a weight in his chest. He gave up, figuring the phone was lost to the bar's chaos, and headed home, the rain soaking his jacket, the fog turning the streets into a maze. His apartment was a 3rd-floor walk-up on Water Street, a creaky building with peeling paint, and a landlord who never answered the door. He climbed the stairs, the wood groaning, and unlocked his unit. The air inside stale, the fridge's hum a lonely sound. He flicked on the lights, bare bulb, no shades, and froze. His phone sat on the nightstand, right where he'd left it that morning, plugged into the charger, the screen dark but alive, a faint green glow. Caleb's breath caught, his hand hovering, the giggle echoing in his mind. He hadn't taken it, hadn't had it since leaving the house. How was it here? He grabbed it, the case cool, no sign of the bar's grime, and checked the call log. His number, 12:07 a.m. A missed call from himself. Duration 2 seconds. His stomach turned, and he dialed Nate, voice shaking. It's back, on my nightstand. Nate's laugh was nervous. Dude, you're drunk. Go to bed. But Caleb wasn't drunk. Not enough to imagine this. And the phone felt wrong, like it carried something with it. He sat on the futon, lights on, the TV blaring a late-night infomercial, but the giggle lingered, a shadow in the room. He checked the windows, locked, the alley below empty, the fog pressing against the glass. The phone buzzed. A text, unknown number, no message, just a blank screen with a black dot in the center, pulsing like a heartbeat. Caleb dropped it, the bat from his closet in hand, and paced, the apartment too small, the walls too close. Banger's night held its breath, and he knew whatever answered that call wasn't human, and it had followed him home. Caleb Monroe didn't sleep after finding his phone on the nightstand, its green glow a silent accusation in the dim light of his Water Street apartment in Bangor, Maine. The rusty anchor's noise felt like a distant memory, drowned out by the raspy giggle that echoed in his skull, a sound that had answered his call and followed him home. The apartment, a third-floor walk-up with peeling paint and a radiator that hissed like a dying beast, was a cage now, its walls pressing in, the windows fogged with the river's damp breath. He kept the lights on, the TV blaring infomercials about miracle mops, but the phone sat on the table, its screen dark, the black dot pulsing like a heartbeat, a taunt he couldn't ignore. He called Nate again, voice shaking. It's here, man, on my nightstand, like it never left. Nate's laugh was uneasy. You're losing it, Caleb. Check your pockets again. But Caleb had checked. Jacket, jeans, every seam. Nothing. The phone a ghost that had slipped back into his life. He hung up, the bat from his closet gripped tight, and stared at the device, its case cool, no trace of the bar's grime. He powered it on, the screen lighting up, and scrolled. Texts, calls, all normal, except that unknown number at 12:07 a.m. A blank message with the pulsing dot. His thumb hovered, then tapped it, the screen flashing black, a static hiss from the speaker, and the giggle returned, low, raspy, closer, like it was in the room. Caleb dropped the phone, the bat clattering and backed against the wall, the radiator's hiss rising to a shriek. The lights flickered, the TV cutting to snow, and the air grew cold, thick with a smell like wet earth and burnt wire. He grabbed the bat, swinging at the shadows, but the Giggle followed, moving behind him, above him, a whisper in the dark. "Who are you?" he shouted, voice breaking, and the room stilled, the Giggle fading to a breath. A voice rasping, "You called. You stayed." The words sank into him, and he knew this wasn't a prank, not a drunk's game. Something had latched onto him, and the phone was its tether. He packed a bag that night. Clothes, the bat, a bottle of whiskey, deciding to crash at Nate's, the mechanic's trailer, a safer haven than this haunted box. The phone buzzed as he reached the door. Another text, same number, the dot pulsing faster, and he left it, running down the stairs, the building's groans a chorus of warning. Nate's place was a mess of auto parts and beer cans, the air thick with oil, and Nate laughed when Caleb spilled the story. "You're spooked over a phone? Relax." But when the lights flickered, Nate's grin faded, and they stayed up, the bat between them, the whiskey flowing. The next day, Caleb went to the Anchor, asking around. Bartender, regulars, anyone who'd been there Friday. Old Man Tucker, a grizzled mill worker with a glass eye, leaned in, voice low. "Heard of that before," he said. "Folks losing phones, hearing laughs. Back in '89, a guy, Eddie, worked the docks, lost his at the bar, found it home, ringing at odd hours, answered once, got a voice, raspy like you said, disappeared 3 days later, phone on his porch, screen smashed." Caleb's blood ran cold. Eddie's story mirrored his, and Tucker added, "They say it's the river. Penobscot takes voices, sends 'em back." Caleb didn't believe in ghosts, but Derry had a way of changing minds. He returned to the apartment, determined to end it. The phone was on the futon, screen on, the dot a steady beat. He grabbed it, the case warm now, and dialed the number, the line crackling. "Leave me alone," he yelled, and the Giggle answered, louder, a chorus of rasps. "You stayed. You're mine." The lights blew out, the room plunging into darkness, and a shadow moved, tall, indistinct, forming by the window, its shape human but wrong, head tilted, eyes glowing faint in the fog. Caleb swung the bat, the shadow dissipating, but the phone buzzed, a video call, static, then a face, pale and eyeless, grinning, the river's roar behind it. He dropped the phone, smashing it with the bat, the screen shattering, the Giggle cutting off. The shadow vanished, the lights flickering back, but the air stayed cold, the smell lingering. Nate came over, saw the mess, and helped clean. But Caleb's hands shook, the river's whisper in his ears. He moved out a week later, a new place in town, but the nightmares followed. Fog, a phone ringing, that face, that laugh. He quit drinking, took a day job, but late at night, he'd hear it. A ring, faint, from nowhere, the Penobscot's call reaching through the dark. Bangor held its ghosts tight, and Caleb knew he'd answered the wrong call, and the river's voice would never let him go.